The first thing on the footage is the bubbles. Then the cage cam steadies, and you are looking out through steel bars into blue-black water. And there are two divers in the frame, in a cage hung off the side of a small boat, and everything is ordinary. There is chum in the water, a brown haze of it drifting down and away into the deep, and the divers are calm, because this is what they came to do. And then the water goes still. The sharks that had been circling, the big pale shapes the divers came to film, are simply gone. All at once, the way a yard full of birds empties a half second before you understand why. For a moment, there is nothing in the frame but the bars and the haze and the dark. And then, far below, down where the blue turns to black, something begins to resolve. It is pale, and it is wide, and it is coming up. It comes up the chum line out of the deep, with its mouth slightly open, and it does not stop, and the scale of it breaks something in your head, because it is wider than the cage, wider than two cages, and it is still rising. The cage cam jolts hard as it hits. The bars bend inward in the frame, actually bend, steel rated to stop a great white folding-like wire, and one of the divers is thrown against the back of the cage, and the water is all teeth and steel and white bubbles. Up on the boat, the deck camera catches the cage line going bar tight, and the stern dropping as something pulls the whole rig down, and you can hear men shouting and hauling. And then the footage cuts to black. Everything you are about to see came off the dive boat's own cameras. The two cameras the divers wore, the camera bolted to the cage, and the camera on the deck. None of it was made to be watched by anyone. It was the automatic record of a small shark diving operation, a long way out over a deep drop-off, doing the most routine thing it does: hanging a cage in the water and waiting for sharks. And what came up the chum line that day should not exist. It should not exist because we buried it, on paper, 3.5 million years ago. We closed the file. We put it in the museum next to the dinosaurs and the other things that are safely, comfortably gone. And then a chum slick reached down a drop-off into the cold dark where we never look, and something came up it. Because here is what every textbook, every museum, every scientist will tell you. The Megalodon, the largest predatory shark the oceans ever produced, has been extinct for around 3.5 million years. It is gone, a fossil, a drawer full of teeth. So hold one question in your mind as we go, the same question millions of people type into a search bar every single month. What happened to the Megalodon? Because the thing that came up at that cage and the single tooth it left wedged in the bent steel do not agree with the answer in the book. Let us go back to the start of the dive and watch it the way the divers did, because they had no idea, none at all, until it was almost too late. The operation was a small one. If you have never been cage diving, the idea is simple and old. You take a boat out to a place sharks are known to gather. You put bait and chum in the water to bring them in close, and you lower people into a steel cage hung off the side of the boat so they can watch big sharks safely from inside the bars. It is done all over the world, and it is, by the standards of being in the water with large predators, remarkably safe. The cage is the whole point. It is built of heavy steel bar, welded into a box, rated to take the full bite and the full charge of a great white shark and not give, because the entire business depends on the people inside it coming back up. This operation worked a steep drop-off, well offshore. Not the shallow, sandy places where most tourist diving happens, but out at the edge, where the sea floor falls away from the coastal shelf into the real deep. Thousands of feet of cold black water just on the far side of the boat. That edge, where the shallows end and the deep begins, is one of the richest and least understood places in the ocean. It is where cold, deep water rises up the slope carrying food, where big animals come to hunt, where life stacks up along the drop in ways we are only beginning to map. The big sharks go there to feed, and the dive boats follow them, anchoring on the lip of the drop, hanging their cages right at the edge of a world that falls away into darkness under the keel. It is also, not coincidentally, exactly the kind of place a large, deep-dwelling animal would patrol, working the same productive slope, hunting the same gathering of life, in the cold and the dark, just below where the cages hang. Most days, the dive boat and the deep things never meet. The cage hangs near the surface. The deep things move through their black water far below, and the two never cross. But a chum slick does not stay near the surface. It sinks, and it spreads, and it runs down the face of the drop-off into the deep, a long brown road of scent reaching down into the dark. And given enough chum, on enough days, over enough years, that scent road reaches something that should never have come up it. There were a handful of people aboard, the way there always is on a boat like that. A skipper who had run these waters for years and had put thousands of divers in the water and brought every one of them back up. A dive master who ran the cage, who knew that steel box the way you know your own car. A deckhand who worked the lines and the chum. And on this trip, a marine biologist aboard to photograph and identify the great whites the operation was known for. These are not people who scare easily, because the job itself is built around staying calm next to animals that could kill you. And a person who panics in the water does not last in this work. That matters through everything that follows, because the easy thing, hearing a story like this, is to imagine frightened tourists inventing a monster out of adrenaline and bad visibility. These were the opposite of that. These were calm, experienced people who spend their lives next to big sharks and know exactly what they are looking at. And what came up the chum line that day was so far past anything they were prepared for that the only reason any of it can be proven is that 4 cameras were running and a tooth came back wedged in the cage. The day was bright and the sea was easy. A light swell, a high sun, the water clear and blue, the boat anchored on the lip of the drop with the deep falling away beneath it. The 2 divers in the cage that morning were experienced, one of them a member of the crew and one an experienced guest, both of them people who had done this many times. And down in the dark below the boat, somewhere along the slope where the chum was reaching, something was already turning toward the scent and beginning, slowly, to rise. The dive started perfectly. You can see it on the footage, the routine of it, the chum going out, the first sharks coming in. Great whites, several of them, big animals, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, gliding past the cage close enough to touch, the divers turning to follow them, the cameras running. For a while, it is one of the best dives the operation ever recorded. And then the whites change. You can see it before anyone understands it. The sharks stop their easy circling and go fast and low, and then they are simply not there anymore. All of them, gone out of the frame in the space of a couple of seconds, the way prey animals leave when a bigger predator arrives. A great white shark is, to almost everything in the ocean, the most dangerous thing in the water. There are very few forces on Earth that make a group of big white sharks flush like startled fish. And on the footage, that is exactly what they do. The divers notice it. You can see them turning, looking. The easy body language going careful. One of them reaching for the cage bars, both of them scanning the blue. Because they have done this long enough to know that when the whites leave like that, something is wrong. There is a long stretch where nothing happens at all. Still water, empty blue, the chum haze drifting down the slope. And the divers waiting, cameras running, looking down into the deep where the bait trail disappears, to find out what made the most dangerous animals they know turn and run. And then they found out. It came up the chum line from below, straight up out of the blue-black deep, and the first thing the cameras caught was not a shape, but a wrongness of scale. A paleness down in the dark that was simply too wide and that kept getting wider as it rose. A broad, blunt, conical head. A mouth opening that was wider than the cage door. A body behind it that did not end, ridged and gray and barnacled, sliding up out of the dark with a slow, terrible momentum, far larger than any white shark, far larger than the cage, as large as the boat the cage hung from. And it was a shark. Not a whale, not a trick of the light or the water. The cameras caught the conical snout, the tall, stiff dorsal fin, the wide crescent of the tail, the rows of serrated triangular teeth, the small black eye set in that enormous head. Every line of it read as one thing, and the marine biologist who was in the water that day knew exactly what she was looking at and could not afford to believe it. It was a megalodon. For 1 second, everything hangs there, the great pale head filling the frame, rising toward the cage, the divers frozen against the bars. And then it closed the distance, and the cage cam went to chaos. This is the part of the footage that does not feel real, even when we are watching it. A creature that size, at a cage built for tourists, in clear blue water, with 2 people inside it. The head comes in, and the jaws open across the entire front of the cage, and the cage cam jolts as the animal makes contact, and the heavy steel bars bend inward like wire under the weight of that head. One of the divers is thrown back against the rear of the cage, pinned there as the bars deform inward toward him, the gaping mouth and the rows of teeth filling the whole world in front of his camera, close enough to touch. He will say later that he was sure, in that moment, that the cage was going to fold flat with him inside it. The other diver is down in the bottom corner, jammed into the smallest space the bending cage still offered, both hands locked on the bars, the camera on her helmet pointing straight up at the underside of a jaw the size of a door. The divers are not fighting it. There is no fighting a thing like that. They are doing the only thing left, which is making themselves small inside a steel box that is no longer the safe thing it was a minute ago, while an animal the size of the boat tests it with its mouth. And on the deck above, the crew are hauling. The deck camera catches it from above, the cage line snapping bar tight, the davit groaning, the stern of the boat pulled down and over as the cage and whatever has hold of it drag toward the deep. The skipper and the deckhand are on the line with everything they have, trying to bring the cage up faster than the animal can pull it down, and for a few seconds it is not at all clear which way it is going to go. Because the animal is not just biting the cage now. It has the cage, the way a dog has a toy, and its weight and its roll are pulling the whole rig down and sideways, and the divers inside are being turned over in the dark, the blue and the deck lights and the brown haze wheeling past the bars as the cage rolls. There is a moment on the helmet cam of the pinned diver where the cage rotates all the way over and he is looking straight down, past the bent bars, into the open deep, and the animal is below him, between him and the dark, and its eye comes around. He talks about the eye more than anything else. Not the teeth, not the size, the eye. A small, deep-set, black eye in that vast ridged head, and for the half second it passed across him, he says it was not blank, not the empty look of a fish. He says there was something behind it, taking him in, the way you feel a large animal register you and decide in an instant what you are. It decided he was not worth the trouble. The jaws released the cage. The great body rolled down and away, and the cameras catch it sinking, the pale shape going gray and then dark and then gone. Back down the slope into the deep it came from, as if the sea had reached up and then simply changed its mind. And the cage, suddenly light, swung back up toward the surface, with two people still inside it, alive. The whole thing lasted under 2 minutes. The crew got the cage to the surface and the divers out of it and onto the deck, and the footage from the deck camera in those first minutes is its own kind of evidence. 2 experienced divers, people who do this for a living, sitting on a wet deck shaking. One of them unable to speak, the other saying the same short sentence over and over, while the crew stand at the rail and look down at water that has gone flat and blue and ordinary again, as if nothing had happened. It is hard to convey what that footage does to you, because for the whole dive up to that point, the danger was an abstraction. Big sharks at a safe distance, behind bars. And then it is a body against the cage with the people. The scale is the thing that breaks people. There is a diver in frame for reference, a grown adult in full gear, and the head of the animal is wider than the entire cage that holds 2 of them. The mouth, when it opens, is a doorway. The eye alone is the size of a fist. And it is not graceful, and it is not slow. It is a mountain of muscle that came up out of the deep, hit a steel box hard enough to bend it, rolled it over, and dragged a boat by its own anchor line, and then let go and sank back into the dark under its own unhurried weight. The sound on the deck audio is the worst part. The shouting and the davits screaming, and then the silence after, which is worse. This is the heart of the footage, and the reason a video exists at all. For under 2 minutes, the most formidable predator the ocean has ever built had its mouth on a cage with 2 people inside it, and 4 cameras were running, and people who should not have lived did, by a margin of inches and one animal's lack of interest. And it is worth saying why they lived, because it tells you something about the animal. It was not hunting them. A shark that size, if it had been trying to take the people in that cage, would have taken them. It had the cage in its mouth. It could have folded the bars flat. It did not. Because the animal was not feeding on people. It had come up a long road of chum scent out of the deep expecting food, and it found a strange steel object with small things inside it, and it tested the object the way a shark tests anything, with its mouth, and found it was not food and let go. The divers were not prey. They were inside a thing that smelled like the edge of a meal, and the distinction is the only reason they are alive. If it had come up hungry and certain instead of curious, the 2 minutes would have ended very differently. When the footage is slowed down and gone through frame by frame, the things it shows hold up, and that is its own kind of evidence. The proportions stay consistent as the body rolls past the cage, the way a real animal's do, and a trick of the light or a misjudged whale would not. The head is the right shape for the teeth. The teeth are the right shape for the marks later found in the steel. The gills, the fins, the ridged hide all read as one coherent animal, lit by sunlight in clear water, filmed from 4 cameras at 4 angles that all agree with each other. That last part matters. This is not one shaky clip from one camera. It is 2 helmet cameras inside the cage, a camera bolted to the cage itself, and a camera on the deck. 4 fixed and moving viewpoints of the same 2 minutes, and they corroborate one another. The thing that is in one camera is in the others, the right size, in the right place, doing the same thing. You can fake 1 angle. Faking 4 that all agree, on a working dive boat with a crew who never sold the footage or cashed in, is a different proposition entirely. The simplest explanation for footage that consistent, that corroborated, and that physically destructive to a steel cage is the one nobody wants to write down. That it is exactly what it looks like. And then there is the cage itself, because they brought it back up. A shark cage is an engineered thing, built of heavy steel bar welded into a box, designed and tested to take the full force of a great white shark, the hardest biting fish in the sea, and not deform. The cage that came up from that dive was wrecked. Not scratched, not dented, bent. 2 of the heavy bars on the front face were folded inward into the space where a diver had been pressed, bent on a curve no tool on the boat could have made. 1 bar was cracked clean through at a weld, and the steel along the bend was scored, raked with deep parallel grooves, evenly spaced, the unmistakable signature of rows of hard, serrated teeth dragged across metal under enormous pressure. Bite marks on a steel shark cage from the outside in. The dive master who ran that cage, who had inspected it 1,000 times, could not explain it. A white shark bites a cage, and you get tooth scratches and maybe a sprung bar. You do not get heavy welded steel folded inward like the side of a tin can. That damage is the signature of something with a mouth far larger than a white shark's, and a body heavy enough to bend steel by leaning on it. The cage itself is a witness, and it says the same thing the footage does. And then there is the one piece of evidence that should not be possible at all. When the crew were stripping the wrecked cage down on the dock, the dive master found something wedged deep into the bent steel, driven in where the jaws had closed and the bars had folded. A tooth. A single, broad, triangular, serrated tooth, the length of a man's hand, dense and pale. The serrations along both edges sharp and clean. He worked it out of the steel and has kept it in a drawer ever since. And that tooth is the thing this entire story turns on because of what it is and what it is not. It is, unmistakably, a Megalodon tooth. The shape, the serrations, the size, there is no other animal it could belong to. And it is not a fossil. A fossil tooth is mineralized, turned to stone over the ages, heavy and dark, the original material replaced by rock. This tooth was not mineralized. It was fresh, dense, but not stone, with tissue at the root. The tooth of an animal that had been alive recently, not one that had lain in the seabed for millions of years. This is the difference that matters, and it is not a subtle one. A fossil is a rock in the shape of a tooth. Over the ages, water seeps into a buried tooth and replaces its material, molecule by molecule, with stone, until what is left is heavy, dark, mineralized, a cast of the original in rock. Every megalodon tooth in every museum on Earth is like this. They are stones. A fresh tooth is not a stone. It is the real material, dense enamel and dentine, with the organic root still there, the way a tooth is when it has recently been in a living jaw. You can tell the two apart by weight, by color, by the way they break, by simple chemistry. A geologist or a dentist could tell them apart in a moment. And the tooth wedged in that cage was not a fossil, which means one of two things is true. Either someone went to extraordinary lengths to fake a fresh megalodon tooth and drive it into a bent steel cage on a boat full of unsuspecting people who have never sold the footage or the story to anyone. Or a megalodon recently was alive and lost a tooth in that steel the way sharks shed teeth constantly through their lives, leaving one behind as it let go of the cage. The dive master who keeps it in a drawer did not sell it, did not call a newspaper, did not get rich. He just kept it because he was there and he knows what came up the chum line, and the tooth is the part he cannot explain away to himself. And here is a detail that ties the tooth in the cage to the teeth on the deep sea floor, the ones that keep coming back too young. Sharks are not like us. They do not get one set of teeth. They shed and replace their teeth constantly, all their lives, growing new ones in rows behind the old and losing the worn ones into the water by the thousand. A single shark drops tens of thousands of teeth over a lifetime. A megalodon would have been the same, shedding teeth endlessly as it fed. Which means that if there were even a few megalodon alive in the deep right now, they would be raining teeth down onto the seafloor constantly, scattering them across the cold, dark bottom the way every shark always has. And that is exactly where the strange young teeth come from. The deep sea bottom, dredged up from the floor where they fell. So the picture is not really two separate mysteries, it is one. A megalodon comes up a chum line and leaves a fresh tooth in a cage. And dredges scrape the deep bottom and bring up megalodon teeth that look far too young to be fossils. Those are the same animal, seen two different ways. The shed teeth on the bottom and the living jaw they fell from. A fresh megalodon tooth. Which brings us back to the question I asked you to hold, and to the real and genuinely unsettled science underneath it. What happened to the megalodon? The textbook answer is 3.5 million years ago, and gone. But the textbook answer has always had a loose thread hanging from it, and that thread is the teeth. Because we have pulled megalodon teeth from the deep ocean floor before, and some of them have come back with dates that should be impossible. Decades ago, when scientists dredged megalodon teeth up from the deep Pacific seabed, they tried to date them by the thickness of the dark mineral crust that slowly builds up on anything lying on the deep ocean bottom. And by that method, 2 of those teeth came back astonishingly young, not millions of years old. By that reading, one was perhaps 24,000 years old, and another as little as 11,000. 11,000 years. Not 11,000 centuries. 11,000 years, which in the life of a species is essentially yesterday, long after the Megalodon was supposed to have vanished from the Earth. To put that in scale, 11,000 years ago there were human beings, much like us, who could have stood on a shore and watched that animal feed. The pyramids would not be built for another 6,000 years, but in the life of a species that ruled the oceans for 20 million years, 11,000 years is the blink of an eye, a rounding error away from the present day. If those dates were right, the Megalodon did not die in some unimaginable prehistory. It was still in the water when our own species was already here, already fishing the edges of the sea. And that is a very different thing from a creature 3.5 million years gone. 3.5 million years is a wall. It puts the animal in another world before us, unreachable, safely extinct. 11,000 years is a doorway. It puts the animal in our world in the recent past, close enough that the gap between then and now is nothing at all in the life of a deep-sea giant that might live for centuries. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between a fossil and a neighbor. Now, I want to be completely honest with you, because the honesty is the whole point. That dating method is not reliable. Measuring the age of a tooth by the crust on its surface is a crude technique, and most scientists believe those young dates are simply wrong, the result of the crust forming more slowly, or the teeth being exposed, or contamination. The mainstream view is that the Megalodon really did die out 3.5 million years ago, and that the young teeth are an error. That is the honest, careful, scientific position, and it deserves to be said plainly. But notice what we are actually arguing about. We are not arguing about whether the teeth exist. They exist. They were pulled from the deep sea floor. We are arguing about whether they are 11,000 years old or 3.5 million. And the only reason we are confident it is the larger number is that we have decided in advance that it has to be. The deep ocean keeps handing us Megalodon teeth. And every so often, one of them comes up looking far too young to belong to a fossil. We explain it away because the alternative is not something a textbook can hold. And the dive boat off the drop-off did not pull up a tooth from the seabed that might be 11,000 years old. It had the animal the tooth came from put its mouth on the cage. And before you say the deep is too cold and dark for a great shark to live in, consider what already does. The Greenland shark is a large shark that lives its entire life in the cold black deep of the northern oceans, in water just above freezing, and it does fine. More than fine. The Greenland shark may be the longest-lived animal with a backbone on the planet, living for 300, perhaps 400 years in that cold, dark, slow, and patient, and almost outside of time. The cold deep is not a dead place. It is a slow place, a stable place, a place where a large, cold-tolerant, slow-moving predator can live for a very long time on very little, undisturbed by the storms and the seasons of the surface world. If a relict population of a great shark were going to survive anywhere after the warm, shallow seas it once ruled disappeared, it would survive exactly there, on the cold, deep slope, slow and long-lived and hidden, in the one part of the ocean that barely changes and that we almost never visit. The deep does not just hide things, it preserves them. It is where the old, slow, enormous things go to last. So let us talk about why a cage, of all things, would be the thing to bring it up. Because the deep ocean is not a place we go. The cold, dark slope below a drop-off, falling away into the abyss, is part of the largest habitat on the planet and the least explored. We have better maps of the surface of Mars. We have laid human eyes, or camera lenses, on a fraction of 1% of the deep sea floor after a century of trying. It is, in every real sense, an unexplored world, cold and black and vast, and we simply do not go there. But we hang things at its door. A cage diving boat anchored on the lip of a drop-off is sitting right at the edge of that world, with the deep falling away directly beneath it. And a chum slick is not a thing that stays at the surface. It sinks, and it spreads, and it pours down the face of the slope into the dark. A scent gradient reaching hundreds of feet down toward the cold bottom. A long invitation running straight into a room no one has ever lit. Almost always, what comes up that invitation is the known catalog. The great whites, the big, and the ordinary. But scent does not know what it is supposed to attract. It reaches whatever is downhill of it in the dark. And once in a great while, the scent road reaches all the way down to something that is not in any catalog, something the deep has been keeping, and that something turns toward the smell of food and begins, slowly, to climb the slope toward the light. That is what makes this different from every story of a fin in the distance or a shape on a sonar. A fin you can mistake, a shape you can argue about. But a cage is a physical thing with people in it, that an animal put its mouth on hard enough to bend steel and leave a tooth behind in clear water in front of 4 cameras. The deep gave up something it had been hiding because a chum slick reached down the slope and called it up. And if a megalodon were down there, in the cold deep we never visit, this is one of the few ways we would ever find out. Not by looking for it. We do not look in the deep. We cannot. But by hanging a road of scent down a drop-off on the one day in a generation when the thing at the bottom of that slope is hungry and close and decides to climb. The crew, of course, were not believed. That is the quiet, grinding part of this, the part that is almost worse than the encounter itself. The skipper had the footage, and the bent cage, and the tooth, and the response he got was the response everyone in his position gets. A big white, they said. A trick of the wide-angle lens. An equipment failure on an old cage. A tall tale from a crew with a business to promote. The dive insurer recorded it as equipment failure and moved on. The diver who was pinned in the cage does not dive commercially anymore. The dive master kept the tooth and stopped showing it to people because of the way they looked at him. And the footage went onto a hard drive in a drawer. That, more than any conspiracy, is how a thing like this disappears. Not because anyone hides it, but because no one is willing to believe it, and so the people who saw it learn to stop talking, and it buries itself. We decided long ago that the Megalodon was a fossil. And once you have decided a thing is a fossil, a fresh tooth is an error, a bent cage is equipment failure. A living animal at your bars is a trick of the light, and you file it all away and look at none of it again. It is worth being clear about what this kind of burial actually is, because it is not a conspiracy, and it does not need to be. No one ordered the footage hidden. No agency confiscated the tooth. There was no cover-up in the way people usually mean the word. There was something quieter and more total than a cover-up. There was disbelief. The crew told their story and were met with the patient. Embarrassed smiles people give to someone they think has lost the thread. The institutions that touched the evidence reached for the nearest ordinary label and moved on. And the people themselves, who had been there, who knew exactly what came up the chum line, learned the lesson that everyone in their position learns, which is that telling the truth about this costs you, and silence is free. So they went quiet. The footage went in a drawer. The tooth went in a drawer. And the whole impossible dive sealed itself away. But the chum keeps going in the water. Because here is the last thing, the thing that should stay with you. This boat was not the only one. Talk to enough people who run cage dives on deep water, who hang their cages on the lip of a drop-off and pour chum down into the dark, and you start to hear, told quietly, and only to people who will not laugh, the same story in different voices. A day when the whites all left at once and would not come back. A stillness, and then something far too big rising up the bait line out of the deep. A cage that came back bent, and a crew that came in white-faced and would not say why. Each one, alone, is nothing. A fishtail, a nervous tourist, a big white and a wide lens. But they cluster on the deep drop-offs, on the days the chum runs deepest, and they have the same shape every time, the whites fleeing, the stillness, the thing that came up the slope. This boat is simply the one that had 4 cameras running and a tooth left in the cage to prove it. And there is a reason those other stories almost never reach you, beyond simple disbelief. A cage diving operation is a business, and a fragile one, run on safety and on reputation. An operator who starts telling the docks that a sea monster bent one of his cages is an operator whose bookings dry up, whose insurer drops him, whose name becomes a punchline. There is nothing to gain by talking and everything to lose. So the people who run the deep drop-offs learn early to keep the strange days to themselves, to call it a big white and an old cage and say nothing else. The stories exist, but they live in wheelhouses and bar corners, traded only between people who have seen something themselves and so will not laugh. That is the real reason the deep keeps its secret. Not because the evidence is missing, but because the few people who hold it have every reason in the world to stay quiet, and the rest of us have already decided there is nothing to hear. Somewhere out there are other bent cages, other shaken crews, other teeth in other drawers. This is just the one where the cameras happen to be running, and where someone decided, finally, that the footage should be seen. So the next time you hear that the Megalodon is extinct, gone for 3.5 million years, a fossil and nothing more, remember the tooth in that drawer. A fresh tooth, not a stone. Remember that the deep keeps handing us teeth that are far too young. And remember that we never go down to the cold, dark slope where they come from. But we hang cages at its edge and pour scent down into it every day. And maybe that is the part that should stay with you longest. Not that a crew filmed a monster, but how close it came and how quietly it was buried. For under 2 minutes, the animal the entire world agrees is 3.5 million years extinct had its jaws on a steel cage in clear blue water with 2 people inside it, real enough to bend the bars and leave a tooth in the steel. It was not a fossil. It was not a legend. It was a living weight that came up out of the deep, an eye that tracked a diver through the bars, a mouth that closed on steel. And then it went back down into the dark, and the world went on calling it extinct, because the alternative is too large to file. The question millions of people keep asking, the one I asked you to hold at the start, finally has an answer that fits the tooth and the cage and the footage. What happened to the Megalodon? Maybe nothing happened to it. Maybe the warm, shallow seas it hunted in cooled and shrank, and it did what the long-lived, cold-tolerant giants of the sea have always done. It went deep. It went down the slope into the cold dark, the one place that never changes, the one place we have never learned to see, and it slowed down, and it waited, and it lasted. It did not go extinct. It went to the deep, into the one part of the world we have never learned to see. And every day, somewhere along a drop-off, a boat is pouring a road of scent down into its dark. One of these days, it will climb the slope again. And maybe next time, the cameras will be running too. And maybe next time, the cage will not come back up. Because it is still down there. The tooth says so. The bent cage says so. The people who will not talk say so. We just stopped looking at the one part of the world where it never left.